an organization that helps underprivileged children get musical instruments. It was a relationship that Eddie started. He used to give them guitars and help them out, and so he wants to foster and continue that organization. So,
right. I think it gives kids instruments so they can play music in school.
Yes,
right?
in schools. Yes, of course. So underprivileged kids, instruments are expensive, and Mr. Holland's Opus helps out with that. He had said that, and he wants to continue with that going forward. And he also said that distance is the closest thing that the public is going to get as a farewell to Eddie, because there's not going to be some sort of official funeral. He was very cagey about what the details were. He says that the family has gathered, but yet to have an official event. He also said he basically can't make it through the video without crying, that it's very overwhelming for him and that it's hard for him to get through, and that Ed's favorite song on the album was Think It Over, which is a more poppier tune. But Ed has heard the whole album and has been listening to it since he finished it. He was obviously very pleased. And so he had seen the band, he had heard the album, so Ed was very much in the know. He was very excited about that. He also noted that he will be moving forward with EVH gear, and he will be partnering with Matt Bruck, which was Eddie's tech, and they are going to run it together. When they asked him what he'd like to put out, he was thinking about putting out his Wolfgang bass and calling it the Ed, because Ed always named his gear after Wolfgang, which is kind of funny. He also addressed the situation about him replacing his father in Van Halen, and he was not happy about that whole rumor. He says, that's fucking stupid. You can't have Van Halen without Eddie Van Halen. I'm not my dad. I'm not going to replace him. I've spent my life making sure I'm not like him. I'm my own person. He says, fans want to see the music continue, but some things just suck, and this is one of those things. He didn't rule out a tribute show or archival releases. He says that'll all happen somewhere down the line. But he says, as for Van Halen, it's done. You can't have it without him. I don't have a dad anymore, and I'm coming to terms with that. And I think the fans can figure out how to deal with the fact that they are not going to have Van Halen anymore. The music will live on forever, but you can't continue without Eddie Van Halen. And then the interesting thing was, he named his band Mammoth WVH. Now, I think he did that because his name is Van Halen, and I think he wanted to get away from the Van Halen part. And Mammoth still kind of ties him because obviously Mammoth, everybody knows, who listens to this podcast, is Mammoth was the former name of Van Halen before they had to change it, because there was another band by the name of Mammoth at that time, but he's calling it Mammoth WVH, and in fact, he actually went to his father and requested permission to use that name, if you can believe that. So his father even knew about that. He told Elliot in the morning, he says, I was a little nervous to ask him, but I wanted his permission. He said, absolutely, that was awesome. And he was super stoked about that whole idea. In terms of the rest of the Stern interview, he talked about playing B-sides live. So he was the one who kept pushing all the different B-sides into the live set, like Women in Love or Drop Dead Legs or Dirty Movies. He kept telling his dad, you've played all these other songs, let's bring out some fun stuff. So he really kept pushing his dad to bring out all those album tracks. And he says he was going wild by the time they did the 2015 tour. And if you look at those set lists, they really had some great stuff in there. And that was all due to Wolf, believe it or not.
Man, thank goodness for that. It's nice to have a fan in the band who knows what people want to hear.
Totally. And now he talks about his father's legacy. He says, between Hendrix and my dad, I don't think there can be or will be anybody ever again who will have the impact that either of those players had on the scene. There's no one like him. He says, well, granted, I'm biased. And he also said that he had a love for the guitar, but I'm sure my mom would tell you it didn't compare with the love he had for me, which was very sweet. One thing that came across in every interview, in all of them, was the warmth that he had between his dad. He was obviously very, very tight with his father. Now, when he went on Trunk came out and he was very detailed about asking different questions from Howard. So he talked about how Van Halen was very, very clamshelled. They didn't talk to the media, and he says that when he asked Wolf why, Wolf said they only talked when they had to or when it mattered, like when they were going on tour, releasing an album. His dad was a very private person, and so was Al. So when it came to PR stuff, Dad was never one in control. He just wanted to play music, and it was, let's only talk when we need to. And he says that they weren't into social media, but they like to keep things private. But in terms of his illness, when Eddie asked him about the illness, like, why wouldn't you kind of clue fans in on what was going on? He says, it wasn't a thought in his dad's mind. It was all about living in the moment. He was very private. All that mattered to him was family and trying to fight through this. So now, obviously, here we are as fans, like, wanting all this stuff. And this guy was obviously struggling. He really called it like 10 years of struggling, which is just brutal to hear. I mean, obviously, Eddie was going through so much and more than he ever let on. And he said here, this quote was unbelievable from Wolf. He says, I know people are desperate for content, but when you look back on it, considering everything that was going on, the fact that Van Halen, since 2007, toured 3 times, put out an album of original material and a live album is pretty fucking incredible. He's obviously saying that considering the situation in Ed's health. So that was very grounding to hear that. So that was really, really intense.
Yeah.
Really intense. And you talked about going to the Tool concert and like that guy having Ed take that photo of him instead of getting a photo with Ed, which is kind of funny. And he got a real kick out of that. And he said Ed went to the Tool concert and he got really blown away by Justin Chancellor, who was the bass player for Tool. He says, fuck, that bass player was the shit. He thought it was amazing. But he did say he nodded out a little bit during some of the concert because he usually goes to bed early. And he said that he really wasn't into a lot of new music. So that whole joke, he said, about Peter Gabriel's So was the last new album he bought. He says that wasn't a joke. Like, he said he really loved that album and that it was definitely, one that was his favorite. And in fact, he noted when he talked to Forbes about the Peter Gabriel album, he addressed it. He says, one song I can't listen to right now is Red Rain by Peter Gabriel. It reminds me so much of my father that it just makes me think of him. I don't really listen to that album, So by Peter Gabriel, because it just hurts too much, because it reminds him of his dad, because his dad loved that album so much, which is interesting to hear. That wasn't a PR line that Eddie gave out, I guess. He says the only new music he was really stoked on was my music. He says he would listen to it and cry at it being so proud and happy. He said, that's my favorite album of all time. So when he was little, he says his mom would take him to go see his dad, and when his dad would do a solo, this is probably around figure like the Balance Tour, okay? He said he would see his dad alone on stage, and he would fight his mom and fight free and run out onto the stage to see his dad, and then he said he would turn and see all the people, and he would be like, who are all these people? He says that's when he realized that a lot of people are there to see his dad, and obviously he's pretty good at what he's doing. Kind of like that's when he realized his dad was famous. He also recorded his album at 3 different studios. He recorded it at 5150, NRG Studios in Burbank, and Elvis Bisquet Studios. That's Elvis Bisquet, his producer of his album. He says he has 28 songs, but they're not all finished, but the album is finished. So that's ready to go.
Didn't he also do some recording in his home studio?
Yeah, I think he did. He might have done some like drum tracks or something like that. Yeah, he did.
I thought he did like some vocals.
Oh, maybe he did some vocals. Yeah,
in the home studio.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
Eddie asked him if he used his father's gear, and he says, it's important for me not to emulate his sound and to find my own. He said, some fans can get really excited about possibilities, but also not think about how that would work and how we would feel about it. I understand how much they love the Van Halen music, but sometimes that's kind of a dumb idea, meaning like him going and redoing Van Halen. And he said when he was in VH, that he did his best to sing his ass off because Mike was amazing and he had to cover that shit. He said it was like going to the School of Hard Knocks because he took a lot of work to pull that off. When he was in Tremonti, he said that was sort of an accident that he went into Tremonti. He was on 2 Tremonti albums and did some tours. He said he happened to be in New Jersey. He was hanging out with Morgan from Seven Dust and he had his gear with him and they needed a bass player and they called him up and he went down there and in 24 hours he had to learn the set and they had a gig in Rhode Island. He says, I was terrified, but I was learning how to play it as I was going and it was a blast. He said it was fun to feel all that energy. Now, Trunk asked him if when he goes in concert if he'll do any Van Halen songs and he said absolutely not. He says, I want to be different. I wouldn't just come out and play Hey Talking About Love. He goes, if I did anything, I'd do like a cool acoustic version of little guitars or something different, but I refuse to tread the same ground as my dad Dad. I need to forge my own path. I'm not going to put out a Van Halen cover album or anything, but I do happen to do something to be under those contexts. So he said his set will consist of all original songs live. When Ed asked him why there was so little music coming out over the years, he says, as you get older, you start to care about different things. The spark wasn't there as much until we got together and did a different kind of truth. Sometimes the fire gets a little dark and you need to throw a log on there. And maybe I was that log for him. And he was dialed down a little, but he never stopped creating. And music was always important for him, but health things became a big deal over the past 10 years. He dealt with cancer, diverticulitis. He had surgery on his colon. He had back issues. I mean, this guy was really in trouble. So he had a lot of stuff that he hid from all the fans. He says stuff started to pile up, and that creative flow was impacted so many times. So that was really, really intense, for sure. And then when Ed started getting into a different kind of truth a little bit, he says the way that whole thing started was they started working on some old songs. When he talked about, going back into the vaults and stuff like that, he says, really, in a way, that's kind of what you got with a different kind of truth. He says, we did pop in and look in the vault and see what are some old songs that never became fully realized. He goes, that's why a bunch of them stem from older ideas. I wanted to put everybody in the headspace of where they were doing back then. He says, Dad was writing music differently than he was back then. He says Van Halen 3 was very different from everything else. Fans are always like, we've got to have another one from the six-pack. Come on, we need the classic stuff. But that wasn't his brain space anymore. You can't force that train of thought out there, but you're not going to get that. He says you're going to get where he is now. And that's what I thought it was important to go back and take a look at what was in there. So he was trying to, I guess, help facilitate the band sort of get into that mode again. Eddie said that he felt like the album was very underrated. He came out and said, I would have done things differently with that album. I think She's the Woman should have been the single, he says, but I was not in charge. When asked about his favorite Van Halen albums, he says in the Roth era, it's Fair Warning in 1984, and in the Hagar era, it's For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge and Balance. But he says he loves them all. Now, getting into, really small details, Eddie asked him about videos in the vault. He says, I have no idea. I know a big thing for the fans is that Oakland 1981 show. I did ask my dad about it. What he told me was this. What was out there was recorded. It wasn't a full show. It was just those songs for a promo. That's what he said. I don't know how you can argue with that. He says, I hope to dig in and find some old video footage. That would be amazing. But from what I've seen, it's just all old tape. But maybe there's a separate vault that I never heard of. And I think that's kind of what Brian Kehoe was talking about. But he didn't see any videotape either, Dave. So I don't know. But it seems to be that Oakland show is really just those three promos.
Yeah, and I seem to have read somewhere, too, that somewhere along the line, like Mike got interviewed in the past and said the same thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so unless the band is mistaken, it sounds like, at least like the video for the Oakland show was just those three. Somebody had asked the question, well, that doesn't mean the audio wasn't recorded. It's like, okay, well, maybe that's true, but I don't think they were separately recording the audio for the show and video for just those three videos. So I think, unless we're all completely wrong, it sounds like we're not going to see Oakland 81, the complete show.
Yeah,
sadly.
I don't.
Unfortunately.
I don't think so. Also, he talked about a different kind of truth. He says the first tracks they did were Bullethead, She's the Woman, and a song called Let's Get Rockin', which will eventually become Out of Space. He told Rolling Stone this. It was never very easy to get anything done in the Van Halen camp. Everybody's very particular. So I was really happy that we actually made the album. So he's telling you right there, like, you get what you get and you don't get upset. That's
yeah.
Yeah,
pretty much. And yeah, I mean, I'm glad that Wolf was able to get Ed and Al and Dave in that headspace, in that classic
totally.
Van Halen headspace. Because I got to imagine it's kind of tough to get the band to go back to that kind of vibe.
Oh, totally.
When they're not there now.
Yeah.
So the fact that he was able to do that, again, speaks volumes for Wolf, that the band was listening to him, was taking him seriously.
Right.
And was able to put out, like you and I say, like a really decent album. It's their last album and a really good one to say goodbye to the band with.
Yeah.
Certainly better than Van Halen 3.
Oh, yeah,
at
well,
least, or the 3 new songs from the Best of Both Worlds compilation.
Right.
So at least we got something at the least that was worthwhile.
Totally.
And at the most is very underrated.
I gotta be honest with you. I mean, that whole thing is beyond me. I do not understand how, if you're a fan of Van Halen, how you're not all over that album. I don't understand that at all. I think it's right in the vein of what fans would want. But, like everything in life is timing, and he talked about the release of A Different Kind of Truth. He said that they would have had a #1 album